Welcome back, guys. My name is Chris, and in this video, we're going to be talking about SAP products. There are hundreds of different SAP products. So when looking at this giant collection of options, I think it's really important to segment things and try to get a concept of how the products work in relation to each other. So with that general concept in mind, I do want to make it clear this video is part of an introduction to SAP video series that I'm making. I believe it's the fourth video in that series. And each of the videos do build off of one of each other. So if you haven't seen those earlier videos, starting with the What is SAP video, I highly recommend you check those out. So diving into SAP products, in my personal opinion, I think the best place to start is not segmenting it by business function, which we will get into a little bit later in this video, but first to just think about where these products are coming from. In other words, categorizing them by creator. And if you don't understand exactly what I mean by that, don't worry, I'm going to lay this out for you. So first off, the first category is a pretty obvious one. It would be products that are created by SAP. So SAP products, and there are many SAP created products, obviously. Generally speaking, you can identify SAP made products by the fact that they have titles that are usually pretty self-explanatory. So something like Enterprise Asset Management. That product name immediately defines what that product does. You don't have to be creative to imagine what that thing is going to be handling. A second pretty obvious signal of what is an SAP made product as opposed to something else is if it is an acronym or not. I don't know what SAP's fascination is with acronyms. It's pretty common in the business industry to have acronyms in general, but when it comes to SAP, it is taken to new heights. I don't know if it's because SAP is an acronym in the first place and they consider that part of their branding strategy, but when you get into the SAP products made by SAP, there are acronyms all over the place. For example, you've got things like S/4HANA, that's a pretty obvious one, but you've also got ECC, BTP, SAC, IBP, BDC. It might sound like I'm just making things up. These are all totally valid SAP made products. So again, pretty standard, simple names along with acronyms. Those are some pretty telltale signs that you're dealing with an original SAP product. The next category down from that is what I would call products made by third-party companies that were then acquired by SAP. So when you're dealing with these ones, pretty obvious indication of a product that has been acquired by SAP and is now in the family of SAP is anything that has a pretty standard marketing title. Ones that you would usually see in the software industry, titles that are catchy or clever names that don't really describe what the product does. So some examples of that would be Ariba, SuccessFactors, Concur, Hybris, Fieldglass, Taulia, Emarsis. These are all just names of products created by other companies and SAP has acquired them over the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. Now, just as a note on that, there is a procedure that generally happens when SAP acquires one of these other products where they try to take it over a period of time, not necessarily instantly. They'll do a transition process where they try to rebrand the product to fit in with the normal branding and naming strategy for SAP products. A good example of that is the Customer Data Platform, or CDP. Obviously that fits in and that sounds like an SAP product, but really that actually came from a product called Gigya. So that's an example where over time they phased out the old name and brought in a kind of more standard SAP naming convention. Down from that, in terms of category, we get to products that are created by third-party companies, but ones that are closely partnered with SAP and officially endorsed and often marketed by SAP themselves. So a few notable examples of that would be Avalara for tax applications. You have Blackline handles. They've got software that can help you with accounting period closes. You also have something like Anapsys for cybersecurity. And then a common one that I'm going to talk about a little bit more later in this video is Databricks. So these are examples of companies that are very, very closely partnered with SAP, and SAP then markets and promotes these products. Those three categories alone, those are hundreds of products. Then you get to the fourth category, which is products that are made by third-party companies, but are not officially necessarily endorsed. They're not promoted. They're not very close partners of SAP. And when you get into that category, there are hundreds and potentially even thousands of products. It's a little bit hard to keep track of all the different options. Usually these products come about by either development companies that strictly make SAP apps and products. That is a common, source and production of these things. But as well, you have consulting companies that do implementations for clients. And in the process of that, they might come up with and design a sort of a solution for a particular problem or situation. And then they realize that they could repackage that more generically and sell that as a product to other clients. So that, again, that's kind of a constant source of these other apps and products that come out in relation to SAP. So when you look at those four categories, we've got a lot of different options for SAP products, and only a handful of them are actually made by SAP. Everything else is either acquired, partnered, or just random third-party products that work with the system. All right, so now that you understand this kind of general product categorization by creator, which, just to be clear, that's not something that's imperative to know or memorize when you're dealing with SAP products. I just personally find that it gives context when you're looking at all of these different variations of products. It allows you to understand, okay, these are ones that are actually made by SAP. These ones came in from here, these from there. It starts to provide a little bit more understanding of what you're even dealing with. So now that we have that concept in mind, I want to pull up a graphic now. This is something that I've shown in a couple videos that I've made so far in this series, and this is an official SAP graphic that they use to try to explain their product ecosystem and how these various layers work together. And as I've said before, while I think this is a very pretty graphic and I think the concept is intelligent, I also don't think it's very educative. You can't, if you don't know anything about the SAP product ecosystem, you can't look at this graphic and immediately just understand what's going on. There's so much additional complexity and depth that's going on that you don't see in a graphic like this. And so you can't intuit just looking at something like this. So what I want to do is I want to dive into some graphics and diagrams that I've created and try to flesh these things out so that this graphic starts to make a little bit more sense in the grand scheme of the product ecosystem. So to start off, I want to focus on one of those little inner blue arches that you see that talks about core ERP system. And I'm going to now transition to a different graphic, one that I've created, to try to lay out what we're talking about here by business function. So when we talk about that, and as I've said in earlier videos, at the core, at the heart of our product ecosystem, we are going to have the ERP system itself. And as we've gone over so far, we know that if we're dealing with, for the vast majority of SAP clients, which are larger enterprise-sized clients, you're dealing with S/4HANA. There's no alternative. That's the product you're going to be talking about in this circumstance. So S/4HANA, we're going to put at the middle of this diagram as our ERP. It is the beating heart of our system. And then off of that, we have 5 primary business functions or business areas, or however you want to refer to it. So you can see those listed out here, and they're pretty straightforward. You've got financial management, you've got supply chain management, human capital management, customer experience, spend management. All of these are critical areas for any business. So now let's take each area by area and try to lay out what are not all the products that you could get in these areas, because honestly, the list can go on and on. It can be dozens or even over 100 products for any one particular area. But let's just take a look for each one at what is the core S/4HANA module that is relevant to this area, and then lay out some of the commonly purchased products or modules relevant to that particular area. So let's start off with the most integral part of any ERP system, which is financial management. And as I've said in the earlier module, when we're talking about S/4HANA, the most important module, almost inarguably, is the financial accounting and controlling modules, which are often just combined and referred to as FICO. So FICO is well, it's technically two modules, but again, that is really one core aspect of the S/4HANA system. But in addition to that, you can have products like Concur, which is for expense management, and you can have things like I mentioned earlier, Blackline, which is specifically to have a more efficient and effective means of having your accounting period closes. You can also have something like Talia, which is to handle working capital management specifically. So a few different options there. And that is the financial management business area. Now let's go to the next one, which is spend management. So when you're talking about spend management from an S/4HANA module standpoint, you're looking at or material management. That is going to be the module that handles getting the items, storing them, that type of thing. In addition to that, you have a very popular series of products, which all come under the umbrella of Ariba, which was an acquired company. And there's three in particular. So first off, you have Ariba Supplier Lifecycle and Performance. This is a product that is meant to onboard vendors, keep track of their performance, and in some cases, even offboard vendors that you're not going to be using anymore. That then leads into Ariba Business Network. The best way I can have to describe Business Network is similar to Amazon. If you go onto Amazon, it is this network where all of these different suppliers and vendors from around the world have gathered to sell you and to provide you the options of thousands or if not millions of different products. Business Network is a very similar concept. It's this network that the vendors flock to. In other words, the vendors are trying to get onto Business Network. They want to be there so that when the customers come onto Business Network looking for products, they find their products. Those are the ones that come up. So it's a system that a customer can come onto and say, I need widgets. And then they can have this long list of vendors or suppliers that provide that product. So they can start to look through them, look at the terms and conditions and the variants of the product, etc., all relevant to whatever they're trying to purchase. And then that feeds directly into the third Ariba product, which is Ariba Guided Buying. So from an Amazon standpoint, this is really just all in the same software where you go onto Amazon, you search for a widget, you've got all of these different options, you choose one, you put it in your cart, you select, you want 5 widgets, you want them in this size or that, you can make various settings. That element of having a shopping cart, being able to pick and choose and having a really efficient system for actually purchasing, not just finding what you want and trying to look for those vendors, but also literally just going, I want this, I need it by these dates, I want this quantity, etc. That's guided buying. And so obviously it's really closely interconnected with Business Network. Now, I should just comment briefly, I've been referring these as Ariba, like Business Network, guided buying, etc. You will often not see the term Ariba used when describing these things. Like you'll hear it called SAP Business Network. And that goes back to the point I made earlier, which is that when SAP acquires companies like Ariba, they then try to phase out the Ariba name and then bring it in as just being SAP Business Network. But you get the concept. That's where it originated from. And those are really the core products, but there's many others that can be used. An example of an alternative third-party application or product that you can get is vendor invoice management. So if you have a huge number of vendor invoices that you need to manage and you want to officially handle that process, you can use Vim to try to accommodate for that. So that is the business function of spend management. Now we get into the third category, which is supply chain management. And this is one that I want to handle a little bit differently because it's very easy to argue that what we've just been describing, many elements of spend management tie directly into supply chain management. That word supply chain management, it really just depends on the context and the usage for it because it can cover so many different things. When SAP splits it off, they are specifically referring to certain products that they consider that fall under supply chain management as opposed to spend management. But I want to pull up a graphic that shows both next to each other, just so you can get a little bit of what I consider a more comprehensive picture of the products that you're going to need to actually fulfill certain business requirements. So to start off, I'm going to split it into 2 tiers. The first tier is going to be everything that I just described with spend management. So these are things like S/4HANA's material management. This is the 3 Ariba products, Vim, and again, you could have many, many more. These are all products that you could look at from a standpoint of how do we get the things that we need, whether it's raw materials or it's products like widgets that we're just going to be reselling, or maybe it's just keyboards and stationery and pens and things that we're going to have in our business just so our employees can work. No matter what it is, these are things you need to purchase from vendors and bring into your company. And that is that first tier. Then we get down to the second tier, which is what SAP considers supply chain management. And this is what I would consider, now that we've gotten these items and these widgets, etc., from our vendors, what are we going to do with them internally and how are we going to get them out to our customers? So you can consider it part manufacturing, part order to cash. And honestly, I could split it into multiple tiers because I know those two things don't necessarily go together super well, but I'm just going to keep it simple. This whole tier is what SAP is considering supply chain management. So in that category, you have, from an S/4HANA standpoint, an S/4HANA module for that would be production planning, also known as PP. But there are many other options. You can have integrated business planning, you can have enterprise asset management, you can have transport management, which is another S/4HANA module, and things like WMS, product lifecycle management, and on and on and on. There are many different options that you can rely on. And the reason I wanted to split these two things into tiers is so that you can get a picture of how you might go about purchasing these various modules and products. If you're a business like a consulting company where you're not selling a product, you're not manufacturing anything, you might just be sticking with that first tier of things that you do need to acquire for the sake of your employees and to run the business. And maybe you'll stockpile them. Maybe you don't even need an inventory management aspect. And you're just reliant on getting things like paper, computers, desks, etc. And that's it. In which case you would get the modules and the products that are relevant to that. However, if you're a company that is buying things to resell or potentially manufacturing things, then you're going to be relying on that top tier to acquire the items. And then you're going to use that second tier's products and modules like production and manufacturing, transport out to your customers. If you have a manufacturing plant, you might need to rely on something like plant maintenance or enterprise asset management to actually facilitate and maintain whatever equipment and plants that you have for the sake of manufacturing. So you're going to use some combination of the various products that you see on these two tiers to achieve both your spend management requirements as well as your full manufacturing and supply chain management requirements. So that is that business function. Let's move on to the next one now, which is human capital management. And when it comes to human capital management from an S/4HANA standpoint, you've got it's named the same. It's called HCM Human Capital Management. That is actually a module that SAP appears to be phasing out. So probably over the next few years, it's going to cease to be supported and eventually will be fully phased out in favor of the alternative product, which is commonly used as SuccessFactors. In addition to these products, you also have things like Fieldglass, which can handle external employees. That might be temp workers, contractors, etc. They also have sales performance management. As the name implies, that's meant for managing your sales teams, their incentives, their commissions, etc. So you have a number of different options there. And then jumping into the last business function, we have customer experience. So from an S/4HANA module standpoint, the most relevant module to this category would be sales and distribution, or SD. As I mentioned in my last video, that is what I would argue is another core module of S/4HANA. Even if you don't go deeper into the lower tier modules, it's still very common to end up getting SD. But in addition to SD, you have a number of other options. Now, similar to Ariba, where there's somewhat of a family of products, there was an acquired company called Hybris, which ended up splitting off into several different SAP products. So starting off, we've got the Marketing Cloud, there's the Sales Cloud, the Service Cloud, and the Commerce Cloud. These are all things that derived from the acquisition of Hybris. And of those four, by far, Commerce Cloud is what I would say is the most popular, the most commonly used. That's something if you've got e-commerce websites that are a core part of your business, you want to manage them, you would do so through the Commerce Cloud. But there are other products in addition to just the Hybris offshoots. That includes Amarsis, which is another marketing type product that you can have. And then you have Customer Data Platform, which, as I mentioned before, that originally came from Gigya. The best way I can describe that is if you've ever heard of Customer 360, you want to get an avatar or a full customer profile on your customers so that you can better determine how to sell to them, how to market to them, etc. All right, so we've now taken a look at the 5 integral functions of any business that revolve around S/4HANA, which is our core ERP system. So now that we've taken a look at that picture, there's another element I want to bring in here that you may have come across, and that is the concept of Business Data Cloud. So to introduce this, I want to go to another graphic here. And we're going to start off at the bottom with what we've already explained, and at this point we should understand pretty well. So let's bring our S/4HANA ERP system down at the bottom, and if we have that, I'm going to offshoot a few different products attached to it, and you can fill in the blanks. That might be something like attaching Ariba or SuccessFactors to the core ERP system. Whatever additional products you want to buy and integrate in with your ERP, those would go along with that. But if you're dealing with a very large company, which many companies that are using SAP are massive and don't necessarily just have one company or one instance of S/4HANA, you might have a large holding company that has many subsidiaries and several of them have their own instances of S/4HANA. So now let's lay that out where we have one instance of S/4HANA and then a totally separate instance of S/4HANA. And let's even take it a step further. Let's say some of the subsidiaries are using different ERPs. So you might have one subsidiary that's now using JD Edwards as their ERP system, and maybe a different one that's using Oracle ERP as their ERP system. So now under the heading of one company, you've got a few different ERP systems, and you now need to figure out how to make these systems work together. Not necessarily that they're going to be transacting with each other, although they might, but you want to be able to gather all that data into one place. Generally speaking, you would consider, well, HANA is the database. That's where you can have the information stored. But for one company, now how do you bring all of these databases and all the raw information from them into one location? And that's where you get to the concept of a data lake or a data warehouse. And for SAP, that product is called DataSphere. At least when you're talking about it from a cloud standpoint, you've got DataSphere, which is going to be this data lake bringing all the ERP information together. It can also receive it from other sources. You might have heard the concept of Business Warehouse. That was an older system or data lake, data repository that can also feed into DataSphere. And in addition to that, even just aside from the information that you have that is your proprietary information from your companies, you might also, as a business, require external sources of information. You might need to get info from Bloomberg or other articles, or maybe the Weather Network. Any source that's relevant to your business in terms of how you're going to run the business and make certain calculations, you might want to pull in that external information. To do that, you would utilize the partnered product from SAP called Databricks. So Databricks is not owned by SAP, but it's a closely allied partner. And Databricks can do a number of things. It can actually serve as a data warehouse on its own. But for the purposes of this, and in this context, Databricks is utilized to go out into these external sources and use AI and a bunch of additional creative tools to try to scrape the necessary information and efficiently bring that in and populate it into DataSphere. So you've got all the information coming in from your various ERP systems, whether SAP ERPs or not, and then Databricks pulling all these external information. You've got your DataSphere where all this stuff is being stored. But now at this point, we have just a ton of random raw information. We want to be able to utilize that information. So now comes another product called SAP Analytics Cloud, also known as SAC. And SAC is obviously an analytics tool that can then tap into DataSphere to pull out relevant information, provide dashboards, visualizations, graphs, reports, and analyses of all this information so that it can be used by management to make effective decisions for the purpose of not just one company, but all of the companies. So that's where SAC falls into this grouping. So we've just laid out a lot of different things, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of context of how these things work together. But notice, as I've described all of this, I haven't one time mentioned Business Data Cloud because I've been laying out what is the infrastructure. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw a box around the top little grouping here with SAC, DataSphere, and Databricks, and that together, that package of products, that is called Business Data Cloud. So it's going to be working in conjunction with what you're already buying with your ERP system and your various other products. These things are going to tie and work together to not only run the companies, but also provide information in one data repository that can be utilized from an analytics standpoint. So that together is your Business Data Cloud. All right, we've talked about a lot in this video. So let's actually punch back to that SAP graphic I showed you earlier. And now some of this starts to clarify. You can see we've got one of the rainbow arches that is our core ERP system. Attached to that, we have these 5 different business function areas that are all tapping into it. And the concept of that is each one of those areas is whatever number of products that you're going to be acquiring or additionally integrating from that area into your core ERP system, which is S/4HANA. And then all of that is going to be, they describe it as sitting on top of the Business Data Cloud. I wouldn't necessarily describe it that way, but it's fine. That's all going to integrate in with Business Data Cloud. And that's that whole section of this diagram that we're looking at. Now, of course, you can see on the top, you've also got Joule, which is the AI side of things. I'm going to be talking about that in a separate video. The next thing I want to introduce you to, something that you may have overlooked in this diagram, which is at the bottom, you have Business Technology Platform. And they somewhat cleverly place the rainbow on top of that to give the concept that everything that you see here is built on BTP, which is a true datum. So this video has gone on for way too long at this point. So we're going to be ending off on this video. And in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at BTP and how it allows all of the things we've just looked at to operate. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. As I've said, this is the 4th video in my Introduction to SAP series, and there's several more videos coming out in this series. On the heels of that, I'll also be coming out with more videos and full-fledged courses diving into specific SAP products. So if any of that's interesting to you, stay tuned, and I hope to see you in the next video.